Okay, the next step in the assessment of the higher cerebral function is to assess the speech. Really, in the assessment of speech, we have to test the language contents of the patient, and we have to test also the articulation and phonation, the speech in general. Really, we have two steps in the assessment. All these two steps are designated just to elicit whether the patient had any disturbance in the speech in the form of aphasia or dysphasia, and dysarthria, and dysphonia or aphonia. What is meant by aphasia or dysphasia are usually used interchangeably during the clinical training, which means that the patient had a defect or difficulty in the language, while the dysarthria means that the patient had a difficulty in articulation, and that of dysphonia means decreased ability to vocalize, while aphonia means inability to vocalize. First of all, I'll test the language ability of the patient by asking him the following questions and order him the following comments. Really, I'll start with comprehension, then fluency, then naming, repetition, reading and writing. First step, comprehension. I'll offer to the patient a paper and I'll ask him to fold it in half and keep it in his pocket if he had, or under his leg, for example. اسحب هاي الورقة، طبق لنا إياها من النص وخليها جوا رجلك اليسرى. جوا رجلك اليسرى. Okay, we'll see these are three steps. The first one, the patient had taken the paper, fold it in half, and then keep it either in his pocket or under his leg. Really, when I order the examination or this test for the patient, I take a place behind the patient, or you can hide your mouth so as not to make the patient lip read you. This is the first step. The second step is the fluency of the patient. We have to ask him about his or her own story, but really our volunteer had no complaint, but I'll ask him about a previous complaint and to see his fluency in the speech. بس حماد تقدر ذاك اليوم تقول لنا شنو اللي صار عندك من دخل أو شيء؟
عندي ظهر التهرب.
إيه بعد اللي بعدها شنو صار؟ صرت زين يعني بعدها أو شيء؟ Okay. We had seen the fluency really in during the clinical examination, and when you have a real patient with ugly time illness, the patient will talk. Listen to his talking, listen to his language, and to see whether the patient had fluent speech or non-fluent speech. This is the second step. The third step is naming. I'll ask the patient about many objects to name it to me. This object should be familiar to the patient. Just like this, I'll ask him the following questions. هاش نسميها؟
ساعة.
هاي ساعة. هاش نسميها؟ ها؟ حلق. هذا شو نسميها؟
قلم.
هذا شو نسميه؟
مسطرة.
مسطرة. مثلا هذا شو نسميه؟
ماس.
هذا شو نسميها؟
مطر.
ما شنو؟ Okay. Really, in patient who had aphasia, naming difficulty, or what we call it anomia, is the most common feature for patient with aphasia. You have to ask him for about 20 objects, but really when you ask him about 5 names of objects, you can take a permission from the examination committee that shall or will you continue or not, and you have to listen for his speech. Really, the patient, if he had inability to name the patient, this condition is called as anomia. Sometimes patient may name the patient, but in the following manner. For example, when I ask him what is this, instead of saying this is a pen, he will say the thing that writes. Okay, instead of that. Sometimes the patient may provide with wrong term or with wrong word, substitution of word. For example, if we in Arabic, for example, if I ask him what is this, instead of saying qalam, he will say malam. This condition, what we call it paraphasia, and we have many forms of paraphasia. This is the third step. The fourth step, I'll ask him the patient simple sentence, and he had to repeat it after me. I'll ask him the following sentence. بس حماد تقدر تقول وراي ذهب الولد إلى المدرسة.
ذهب الولد إلى المدرسة.
Okay, this is a simple sentence just to test the patient's ability to repeat the sentence, or he had the capability to repeat the sentence or not. After that, I'll ask him to about the reading. Really, in reading, the best action is to ask the patient to read motor commands, motor acts. For example, I'll write for him the following sentences. Okay, if we had a focusing here, I'll ask him the following acts. First of all, I'll ask him to raise his right hand or arm. Then I'll ask him to withdraw his leg, and then to raise the left hand. For example, I'll ask him to read them and to perform them if the patient had the ability to read and to write. حماد تعرف تقرأ تكتب؟ استقرأنا ذني.
ارفع يدك اليمنى.
يلا طبق لنا اياها. اوكي. عشت ايدك هسه نزل يدك، هسه بعد شنو؟
اسحب رجلك.
اي. هاي انت اساسا ساحبها، اوكي.
ارفع يدك اليسرى.
ارفع يدك اليسرى. عشت ايدك. Okay, so the patient had the ability to read and had the ability to perform the following motor acts. After that, the last step in the speech assessment of the language content of the speech, I'll ask him to write something. But in reality, writing here, we can also ask the patient to write his complaint, the same story that we ask him at the start when we test the fluency. We can ask him also to write these events. هسه حمادة تكتب لنا اللي قلت لنا اياه صار عندك ذاك اليوم. شنو اللي صار عندك ذاك اليوم ممكن تكتب لنا اياه. وين بعد وراها شنو اللي سويته رحت وين رحت شيء. Okay, let's see what our volunteer had. Right, he said that he had some sort of dizziness in Arabic, really, and then he had some sort of pre-syncope or syncope, and then he consulted the hospital at that time. Why this is important? Because patient with paraphasia, as we said previously, who had substitute one word with another, but when we ask him about his complaint to talk about, he will say, for example, as I said previously, he had, instead of a pencil, he will say a pencil. In Arabic, instead of qalam, he will say malam. He will write the same thing. He will write malam instead of qalam, and this is important to first of all test the writing ability and to confirm any paraphasia. This is really with respect to the assessment of the speech content. Then the next step in the assessment is to assess the articulation and phonation of the speech. I'll ask him the following speech, and each one of them had a meaning in the examination. First of all, I'll ask him to repeat the following, or a sentence, a word, with the or L or T, the following letters. I'll choose a simple one. حمادة تقدر تقول لا 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 لا.
لا 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 لا.
Okay, I did it. This will test the lingual capability to produce letters. And then I'll ask him about the lip function. I'll ask him to repeat after me the following sentence. هسه بعدي تقول مي 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 مي.
مي 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 مي.
Okay, so tongue function is intact and lip function is intact. Then I'll ask him to repeat the following sentence to test whether the patient had monotonous speech or scanning speech for cerebellar dysarthria and so on. Also, we have to look about the tongue and lip function with the following in the following sentence. هسه أريدك تقول الجامعة المستنصرية.
الجامعة المستنصرية.
Okay, we're listening for all these letters. After that, I'll ask him to count from 1 to 30, and lastly, I'll ask him to cough. Why? From 1 to 30 to assess whether the patient had fatigable dysarthria, that is characteristic of a neuromuscular junction disorder in the form of myasthenia gravis, for example, the most common, or not, and then to cough to see whether the patient had involvement of the palate or not. طيب هسه أنت أريدك تحسب من 1 ل 30.
1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 13 14 15.
Okay, I'll satisfy up to this level, but at the time of examination you have to continue up to 30, and I'll ask him now to cough to see whether the patient have bovine cough or not. هسه بس خلينا ايدك هيجي وتقع. Okay, so he had no any bovine cough. From these sentences really, or from these steps, one can decide whether the patient had dysarthria in the form of spastic dysarthria, in the form of flaccid dysarthria, in the form of cerebellar or ataxic dysarthria, myasthenic dysarthria, extrapyramidal characteristic of Parkinson or not, and also listen to the voice of the patient, whether he had whether the speech had low volume, or the patient had dysphonia or unable at all to produce sound. He had the ability to produce the sound, but he can't because of the involvement of the larynx, and this is characteristic of dysphonia and of